Flight attendant refuses food to black cancer patient. 6 minutes later, she was fired immediately. The sound of broken chinaware cut through the noise of the plane. Crumbs and tomato soup splashed across the aisle, staining the carpet like newly formed wounds, cold and indelible. The tray slipped from Eleanor Martin's weak fingers, and before she could process what had happened, a sharp crash shattered the silence of the flight. Broken china and streams of tomato soup littered the aisles where passengers shuffled past, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold before their eyes. Eleanor sat there, her hands shaking, not because the cancer had taken the life out of her, but because of something deeper. A rage, buried for so long, finally erupted. She felt the contempt in the air, felt the coldness of a woman who looked at her like an incident. Kelly, the flight attendant who had refused her service, stood opposite, her name tag clearly reading, Kelly. Kelly's eyes hardened, and she smiled a fake smile, the kind of smile that anyone can recognize when patience is wearing thin. "Ma'am," Kelly said, her voice cold, "like I said, we don't have any special dishes for your condition." The word condition was heavy and cold, like a cut, thickening the air in the cabin. It wasn't just the word, it was the disrespect, the indifference. And then, as if the entire cabin had stopped breathing, a blonde, ponytailed passenger in the back pulled out his phone and started recording everything. The tension in the air was palpable, like a fuse ready to explode in a way no one could have foreseen. In that moment, Eleanor knew that in 6 minutes, everything would change. 6 minutes, Kelly's career would be over, her reputation would burn like a log. And Eleanor Martin, tired of cancer, tired of apologies, tired of living as a show, would have to say just one thing, in a firm but unwavering voice: "I need to talk to your supervisor." And at that time, no one knew that a new war had just begun. Eleanor Martin, 65, has spent the past 3 years in a relentless battle with cancer. Chemotherapy, debilitating pain, pieces of her body slowly being taken away, but her vitality has not been defeated. A mother and grandmother, Eleanor has witnessed the ups and downs of her family, from toddlers to grown grandchildren. Each family's story is an indelible mark in her mind. But now, as the disease is wearing away at her body, all she can do is try to stay strong. This flight, like many others, was part of a long journey she had never wanted. She was on her way to the city to see a famous doctor, hoping for a new treatment that could extend her life by a few more months, a few more years, so she could stay with her family, with the people she loved. Today's medical appointment was not a normal medical appointment. It was like a last chance, a ray of light in the endless darkness that every cancer fighter hopes for but knows can go out at any moment. Eleanor sat by the plane window, looking out at the white clouds drifting by, like distant memories of happy family years. Those days, she was still healthy, able to take care of the children, holding her husband's hand and walking in the sunlight. Time seemed to suddenly become blurry. She felt tired, not only because of her illness, but also because of other things, the invisible disrespect she had to face every day. She wondered, was this life only a fierce battle with life? Cold eyes and lack of care from those around her? Just a look, a word, or even a small action could make a dark day heavier. But she remained resilient, holding her head high like many mothers and grandmothers who had taught their children and grandchildren about perseverance and inner strength. The laughter of her children and grandchildren from the past kept playing in her head. She couldn't let go, couldn't bear to leave them. And though her body was slowly weakening, her resolve never wavered. Eleanor had learned to live in the moment, but today, in the middle of this flight, she felt something else. Not the pain of illness, but the deep hurt of the way she had been treated, the disrespect she couldn't bear to silently accept. Even though no one could see it, she could still feel the disappointment from other people's strange actions, especially at times like this. Had she fought all these years, only to receive such coldness in return? She couldn't let that continue. The doors of the business class cabin opened softly, the sound of wheels sliding across the floor echoing in the silence. Kelly stepped in, a tray of food neatly placed in her hands, her face elegantly adorned with a friendly smile, a smile she had become accustomed to from the endless hours of work. But there was something unnatural about the smile, as if it had been worn down by 1,000 repetitions. It was not a bright smile of welcome, but a forced one, the kind of smile one uses to hide the weariness that is lurking. She approached Eleanor, her eyes scanning her hurriedly, as if searching for a reason to move faster, to finish this job as soon as possible. Kelly's every step seemed to weigh down the air, further aggravating the loneliness Eleanor was feeling. She placed the tray in front of Eleanor, then paused, tilting her head slightly, still keeping a faint smile. "Ma'am," Kelly began, her voice flat without any softness. "As I said, we don't have any special food for your condition." The words fell like cold stones, unmoving. "Your condition." The statement was an impersonal announcement, not an apology or sympathy, but simply an assertion that Eleanor was a condition that did not need further attention. It was not just a rejection, but a denial, as if Eleanor did not deserve the most basic respect, the most basic compassion that humans can give to one another. Eleanor looked up, her eyes tired, not from the illness, but from the way she was being treated. It wasn't the first time she'd felt like an inanimate object, but this time was different. Now that she was facing death, such small acts of disrespect were all the more insulting. She'd fought through pain, through endless days, but she'd never felt like this. Like a living person was nothing more than a number, a piece of data to be discarded. She couldn't keep quiet any longer. A fire was burning inside Eleanor, a fire of determination, of dignity that wouldn't be trampled any longer. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady despite the shaking in her body. "I need to talk to your supervisor." The words weren't loud, but they rang out clearly, like a challenge. Not because she wanted the special food, but because she couldn't accept this treatment. Couldn't accept being just a status, an invisible object in the eyes of others. The cabin suddenly fell silent, a strange tension filling the air. No one said anything, but everyone could sense that something had changed. Eleanor couldn't take it anymore. It felt like an iron cage around her, heavy and suffocating. Every moment was a reminder of the indifference she faced, the indifference of a world that no longer cared about the sick, no longer saw the preciousness of life. Not just because of the pain of cancer, but because of the disrespect, the contempt, the denial of human worth that Kelly had inadvertently released through her cold, unsympathetic words. Eleanor felt every thread of her patience being stretched to the breaking point. She was sweating not just from the illness, but from the cruelty of the rejection. The feeling of resentment rose, followed by a wave of anger that had never been so strong. The cabin was silent, except for the tense silence between her and Kelly. Unable to sit still any longer, Eleanor suddenly stood up, her hands on the table, taking a deep breath to try to regain her composure that had almost crumbled. But something had changed in her. Her eyes, which had been dimmed by the fatigue of illness, now shone with a surprising light. It was not the weakness of a woman about to collapse, but the determination of a mother, a grandmother, who had suffered enough. The illness might have weakened her body, but her spirit, the self-worth she held, no one had the right to hurt. Eleanor's voice rang out clearly, without a hint of weakness. "I need to see your supervisor." Every word she spoke was a finality, a strong affirmation that she did not need an apology, did not need pity, simply needed respect. She had lived long enough to know that respect was never a favor, but a human right. Kelly couldn't help but look at Eleanor. The flight attendant's head was down, a little confused, but there was no denying that the firmness in Eleanor's voice had made a difference. No one said anything more. Eleanor stood firm, walking step by step toward the supervisor, each step affirming that she would not back down. What she felt was not victory, but a reclamation of justice, a small but powerful justice, not for herself, but for all those like her who were still overlooked in a society where respect seemed to be a luxury. The entire cabin seemed to register a change. The eyes that followed her were not of pity, but of respect. Eleanor Martin, in this moment, had not only stood up for herself, but for all those who had been overlooked, ignored throughout their lives. The atmosphere in the cabin gradually became heavy. Every breath of the passengers seemed to be imprisoned in an unusual tension. A young passenger, his jet-black hair loose, quickly took out his phone from his pocket and began to record the scene that was happening. Just such a small action, but it created an invisible wave of change. as if the invisible wall of privacy between the passengers had collapsed. The phone was like a fuse, and immediately, everything began to change. The light of the screen flashed, reflecting a space that seemed quiet, but secretly contained the urgency of decisive moments. In a few short seconds, the entire cabin seemed to be thrown into a storm. Eyes no longer glanced casually at each other. Every pair of eyes, from the passengers sitting nearby to those at the back of the cabin, were fixed on Eleanor and Kelly. An irresistible attention had enveloped everything. From Eleanor's perspective, the eyes of the others were like a sound wave. The eyes stared not with curiosity, but with anticipation, waiting to see what would happen next. A confrontation between power and righteousness, between the one who hurt and the one who suffered. The passengers were whispering to each other, no longer furtively, but now louder, more clearly, as if they were witnessing an important scene not to be missed. "She can't do that," a voice said, muffled by the noise of the plane, but no less angry. "She's too much," another passenger added. A few, who had seemed unconcerned, couldn't help but turn their heads, their eyes lighting up a little, not out of pure curiosity, but because of the quiet awakening in the air. It felt like a smoldering fire was burning. This was not just Eleanor Martin and Kelly's story. It was becoming the story of everyone on this flight. Everyone in the cabin could feel the tension in the air, a shared feeling that no one could avoid. Everyone knew that something bigger was happening, and they couldn't stand aside. Even though no one spoke, the attention painted a different picture, not just of what was happening in the cabin, but of human values, respect, and fair treatment. This space was no longer just a business flight. It had become an unavoidable space of injustice and justice, where all eyes were on the same spot. There was a buzz of chatter, silent glances were exchanged, and Eleanor, standing at the center of the tension, kept her composure. She knew that this confrontation was not just between her and Kelly. It had become everyone's fight, a quiet yet powerful fight for respect and dignity. The cabin door opened. A large door opened in the tense space, and the supervisor walked in. Her steps were heavy, as if she knew that she was entering a situation that could not be resolved easily. The bright light from the ceiling of the plane illuminated her face, creating a faint shadow on her face, as if the light wanted to hide the truth of what was happening. The supervisor looked at Eleanor and Kelly, her eyes moving back and forth between the two, but not in a hurry. Only the suffocating atmosphere could not be avoided. The people around had stopped whispering, leaving only the buzzing sound of the plane and the pounding of Eleanor's heart. Eleanor stood firm, like a fighter, her hands still shaking, but not from illness, but from a determination that had overcome all pain. She turned to the supervisor, her eyes unwavering. "I demand an immediate apology and a proper resolution," she said, her voice cold, but also resolute. Each word felt like a fatal blow, pushing everyone into an irreversible situation. The entire cabin seemed to stop for a moment. The supervisor glanced at Kelly, then back at Eleanor. Although she tried to maintain a calm appearance, no one could deny that the atmosphere had changed. Too many eyes were on them, and it was inevitable that everyone would pay attention. This conversation was no longer just a personal matter between Eleanor and Kelly. It had become a test of respect and justice. After a few seconds of silence, the supervisor said nothing more. She just nodded, not sympathetically, but enough to know that she knew what was coming next. She turned to Kelly, her eyes cold. "You are hereby terminated immediately for unprofessionalism and disrespect for customers," the supervisor said, each word heavy, like a sentence that could not be reversed. Kelly stood there, surprised and confused, as if she could not believe what was happening. But it could not be reversed. Things had gone too far. The supervisor didn't hesitate. "You must leave the flight immediately," she said, and her voice was firm, leaving no room for mercy. Kelly backed away, no protest, just silence filling the air. She turned and walked out of the cabin without looking back. Each step she took was a finality, not just for her career, but a reminder of what happens when respect is violated. And when Kelly stepped out of the cabin, everything in the cabin quieted down. No one spoke, but everyone felt a change. Eleanor, who had endured so much, now felt a sense of relief, as if a burden had been lifted. Not because she had won, but because she had finally heard her voice. And the silence that followed was not the end, but the opening of a recognition, a respect that she had earned. The flight continued in silence, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. When Eleanor returned to her seat, her hands were still shaking, but inside, a sense of relief washed over her, as if everything that had been bad about her illness and pain had suddenly become lighter. She no longer felt like an abandoned patient, no longer felt like a condition that others could easily ignore. She had stood up, not just for herself, but for those like her, those who had no voice, those who were treated as if they were not worthy of respect. The sense of pride came not from some great victory, but from the fact that she had stood up for herself, had dared to speak up, had dared to demand justice in a world that often forgot respect. Eleanor looked out the window, and the silence of the flight seemed to reflect something in her soul. Everything outside the window seemed blurred in the pale light of the afternoon. But inside her, a strange sense of peace washed over her. She had not only defeated the cancer that threatened her life, but also the injustice that had been forced upon her for so long. The years of fighting the disease had not been easy, but nothing compared to fighting to be recognized, respected, and treated as a valuable human being. She did not need another apology, did not need a drastic change in the world. All she needed was to know that her voice had been heard, that she could stand firm in moments that seemed impossible. The flight continued, but for Eleanor, today's journey ended in a way she never imagined. A journey not to a city, but an inner journey where she found her strength, where she realized that respect is not a privilege, but a basic human right. As she sat there, her hands still shaking but her heart at peace, she knew that she had done something greater than she thought. And in that moment, she was not just a patient fighting cancer, but a woman who had taken back the power in her own hands. Eleanor did not just fight cancer. She fought prejudice and indifference throughout her life. Things that seemed invisible but were always present, silently gnawing at human strength. Every day, she learned to stand up, not only for herself but also for others, those who had no voice to defend themselves. And no matter how difficult it was, no matter how much her health declined over time, she still chose to live strongly, to persevere, not letting anyone or anything bring her down. She understood that, sometimes in life, resilience and courage are the only things that can make us feel truly alive.